To summarize the Civil War, it is the most deadly war in U.S. history. And it's the first industrial war in human history. By industrial war, that means massive armies that are using weapons from the new industrial revolution taking place. In industrial wars of this scale, civilians are almost as important as soldiers. Civilians in factories making the weapons for the war. That is why the death toll was so high. The weapons were a level of destruction that hadn't been seen before. And this number is low. It's not 620,000. It is, estimates are now up to 750,000. And if you're wondering how could 130 dead Americans just have been overlooked, that is true in every war and every pandemic of this scale. We find new records, we find new mass graves, and it's true in every single one of them. It will be true of COVID. The number we have now is going to be much higher decades from now. So what's the significance then? Damn well better be a significance with that many Americans dead. First and foremost, Civil War established the United States is a united nation, and states cannot secede. Before the Civil War, Americans would frequently use the term the U.S. are. The U.S. are a great country, referring to "are" as in the states. And there's programs that study language of the past and words people used. And after the Civil War, Americans will start using the phrase, the U.S. is. It is one nation. Second, Civil War will lead to the destruction of slavery. The United States has been a slave country longer than it has been a country without slavery. With the Civil War, the United States advanced further to becoming a country that is dedicated to the ideals of that radical document, the Declaration of Independence, that stated all men are created equal. As I mentioned before, that is an ideal set out from the beginning of the country that is incredibly radical, and throughout the long course of U.S. history, it has moved up in that direction gradually. There have been setbacks, but over the course of U.S. history, it has been to try to achieve that objective. Lincoln did not fight the Civil War to end slavery. He made it very clear if he could have ended the Civil War without freeing any slaves, he would have done that. But in order to end the war more quickly, he elevated the entire war to a higher cause with the Emancipation Proclamation, which guaranteed the United States would end slavery when it ended, which it did with the 13th Amendment. Congress officially abolished slavery. If you remember at the very beginning of the semester, my introduction lecture, I mentioned that the United States is 4.2% of the world's population and contains about 25% of all prisoners in the world in this one country. It's one of the statistics that is not positive. And if you want to know why, Section 1. Slavery is prohibited, except as a punishment for crime whereof the parties shall have been duly convicted. The one exception to slavery in the United States is for criminals. Africans were brought to the United States for cheap labor, and that is after the 13th Amendment. Jim Crow laws will be passed. That will put blacks in a legally inferior position and keep them in poverty. Once Jim Crow laws are undone in the 1960s, that is when all of a sudden the prison population spikes. If you take the second half of U.S. history with me, I will talk about this in more detail. It is a major flaw of the 13th Amendment. But, nevertheless, Civil War ended slavery. Third impact, political. Because the Republican Party was the party that preserved the Union, they will emerge dominant. From the beginning of the country until 1861, for the first 72 years of U.S. history, slave owners will control the presidency for about 50 years, 49 years, I believe. So for the vast majority of the first part of U.S. history, slave owners will control the government. And slave states had an inordinate amount of power, especially because they were a smaller part of the population. After the Civil War, in U.S. history, it is a period called the Republican era. From 1860 to 1932, with the election of Franklin D. Roosevelt, Republicans will control the presidency the entire time except two presidents, Grover Cleveland, who was incredibly conservative, so Republicans didn't mind him, and Woodrow Wilson. And both were elected because the Republican Party was split. There was only two Democrats elected in this entire period. So it has a huge political impact. Fourth, economic. Southerners had a huge amount of power in the government, and in the Senate, in the White House, and they had been promoting their economic interest since Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was all about the agrarian economy, which even during his lifetime, we knew as a society that agricultural-based economies were incredibly unequal, and they were also backwards. Agricultural-based economies did not produce middle class, and also it prohibited a country from developing. So, when the Civil War started and the South took themselves out of the Union, the national government will pass legislation aimed to benefit the North. You definitely don't have to memorize this, but they will pass a lot of legislation that Southerners had continuously killed, such as a higher tariff, protect U.S. manufacturing, Homestead Act, that will bring a lot of people out west, and it will populate the western part of the United States. So the population of the United States will start growing and expanding westward. Pacific Railway Act, which will establish the first transcontinental railroad and create a national transportation system. The Morrill Land Grant College Act, which will create a system for creating colleges in states. And I cannot stress this enough. In order to have a good, strong economy, you need to have an educated population. And national banking acts. Since Andrew Jackson, the United States had its banking system was a mess. There was not a universal currency, and it was just a disaster. This doesn't create a national or central banking system. That won't be created until the Federal Reserve in 1913, but it creates a lot of changes to the banking system, to the monetary system, creating more universal currency, creating a lot of banking regulations that will greatly enhance the banking system, which is absolutely essential for a capitalist system. So there's more than this, but just to point out, the Morrill Tariff, Pacific Railway Act, and the National Banking Act, those are all things Alexander Hamilton had called for in his report on manufacturing and report on the National Bank. We had known since Hamilton's time that these are the things that make a strong economy. It is, and he had modeled it after England. So everything Hamilton had called for, almost everything Hamilton had called for, will eventually pass, and it will make the United States into the world economic superpower. Thomas Jefferson and Andrew Jackson, their economic policies had been to advance agricultural-based economies, and they had held the United States back for a long time. The Civil War will accelerate the United States and will launch the Second Industrial Revolution, which will lead the United States to become the world economic superpower by the 1870s. This probably could have happened a long time earlier if there hadn't been Southern opposition and agrarian opposition to this. So, but it's not even all bad for farmers. They also created the Department of Agriculture to help agriculture and farmers. So this is when the United States becomes the world economic superpower, and wars are horrible, but wars of this scale lead to some massive advancements. Just to produce all the weapons, they had to create factories and to create a transportation system, and so it will hyper accelerate the United States into becoming an industrialized, advanced world superpower. In contrast, the South is utterly devastated. Just freeing of the slaves wiped out somewhere in the neighborhood of $4 or $5 billion immediately. And remember, slaves, on average, for an ideal male slave, they cost, in today's dollars, somewhere in the neighborhood of like $48,000, $50,000 per slave. So it was a huge, it was obviously a huge loss for slave owners, but the entire Southern economy will be absolutely devastated and destroyed, and it stays destroyed. And Southern economy will be a third world country until the New Deal. It's not until the New Deal that it's built up, finally, and it becomes a livable place for a lot of people, and it becomes more advanced. The entire region was considered the United States' #1 economic problem as late as 1937. So it will have vastly different consequences for the North and the South. Arguably, the most important significance of the Civil War, though, is the preservation of democracy. And this is due to the leadership of Abraham Lincoln. The United States was fighting for its very survival. Had the South won, the United States would have broken up, and the United States would never have become a world superpower. So it was on the risk of complete collapse. In most places in the world, when there is this much threat to an entire nation, presidents will, whoever's in charge, will say, no, we're not going to have an election. The stakes are too high. The election of 1864 demonstrates how great Lincoln was, because he never once considered it to not have it. And there were a lot of people that said, we need to not hold this. You need to stay president because there's too much on the line, but he never would consider it. And that is especially important because he ran against his former general, the general that he fired 3 times, George McClellan. McClellan was a Democrat, and McClellan made it very clear if he won, he would work for peace. He was going to try to work for a peaceful negotiation with the South, and very possibly allow the South to become its own nation. So the stakes were incredibly high. Lincoln had a lot of pressure to not have the election, and he never once considered it. And the reason is because the entire Civil War started by a failure of democracy. In 1860, the South lost an election, a free and fair election, and then they rejected the outcome because they didn't like it. That's why Lincoln insisted on having an election, is in order to preserve the fundamental tenets of democracy, free and fair elections. And he actually was convinced that he was going to lose. He wrote his letter of defeat of what he was going to say when he lost the election. So the stakes were incredibly high. He had a lot of pressure, and he still did it with the belief that he was going to lose. And he didn't, obviously. He won with 55%. But it is one of the greatest acts in all of U.S. history, is just holding an election in a period of such crisis. A couple things amaze me. One, we won by 55%. Take a look at that. 45% of Americans thought Abraham Lincoln was doing a terrible job. Just so you know, that is what America is like. Every single election, virtually every election, not all, most of the time, you have at least 40 to 45% of the population that is going to vote Democrat or Republican no matter what. Doesn't matter who's the candidate, doesn't matter what the issues are, doesn't matter what the person stands for. That is U.S. history. It is the majority of the population. They have already decided which party they're going to vote for. And yeah, it amazes me that 45% of the population thought Abraham Lincoln was doing a bad job. And the other thing that's so amazing about this is why he insisted on having a presidential election, why he insisted that preserving democracy was so important. And it's because of what it had done for him. Abraham Lincoln was born dirt poor. And from dirt poor beginnings, he was able to get an education and through completely legal means, work his way all the way up to become president of the United States. That is not something that you could do most other places in the world at this time. It made the United States so unique. And It is such a fundamental part of the United States. Democratic form of government, specifically a republic, had existed from the very beginning, and it is the best form of government in that we know of. We've never found a better form. Now, democracy is very flawed. Let's be very clear about that. There are flaws to democracy, especially pure democracy. It has never existed and it has never worked. But representative democracy has flaws, but it is still the best form of government we have ever seen. That is why this is a picture of Lincoln before and after. Before he entered office and after, right? Very, very shortly before he was assassinated. And you can see how much he aged. Lincoln is one of the most sensitive presidents we've ever had in U.S. history. At the age of 9, he saw some kids that were burning, had a turtle on its back and was burning its stomach, and he said, I guess you guys should stop that. I think you're hurting him. And they beat him up. It was unheard of to believe that animals had feelings. Humans genuinely didn't believe animals had feelings for a long, long time. He only hunted once. He only killed something once. He disliked violence. I mean, he wrestled. He was great at wrestling, but he didn't like killing. During the Civil War, he will oversee the killing of the most Americans of any person. And he did it because he believed so firmly in preserving democracy for what it would do for the world, what the United States could do for the world, if it maintained a democratic system. And people that saw him in the White House, they always described him as being haunted by every single death that happened. The happiest people saw Lincoln when he was in the White House was in the evenings he would go and get the stack of papers of soldiers, U.S. soldiers that were going to be executed for like desertion or being court-martialed or whatever. And he would get out his pen and he would go through the list and just pardon them. He'd say stuff like, this 17-year-old ran from battle, dropped his gun and ran from battle. I bet I would have done that when I was 17. I'm going to pardon him. His Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, was just furious about it. His generals were angry. They're like, you're undermining us, but it brought him so much joy just to spare one person's life. He gave everything to preserve democracy. If you take anything from this class, remember democracy is the representative democracy, is the best form of government, and that we have found thus far. And thank your lucky stars for Abraham Lincoln.